I stood at the edge of the dimly lit ballroom, watching Cassie from across the room as laughter and applause filled the air. She was radiant, a vision in silver, captivating everyone around her. But the familiar pang of unease gnawed at my insides. Something was different tonight. Her gaze lingered too long on a face I didn't recognize. My pulse quickened as I watched her exchange a hidden, knowing smile. Was it paranoia? Or was my world about to shatter? My name is Zachariah Davis, but everyone calls me Zach. I'm 34 years old, a bit over 6 feet tall, with dark brown hair, a sharp jawline, and a lean build. I've spent the better part of my adult life working as an MRI engineer, a job that has me flying across the country for emergency repairs at hospitals. It's rewarding but demanding, and I've learned to appreciate the small windows of peace I get in between trips. Houston has always been home, a city that's both vibrant and familiar, much like my wife, Lisa. Lisa and I met almost a decade ago at a friend's wedding. She was radiant that night, catching my attention the moment she walked into the room with her auburn hair and captivating smile. Lisa was 32 now, a CPA at a hospital near Rice University. She had that perfect mix of charm and independence, and though her beauty was undeniable, it was her spirit and intelligence that truly won me over. Our courtship wasn't complicated. It was the kind of natural, effortless connection that makes everything else around you fade. After a year of dating, we bought a small but cozy house just on the outskirts of downtown, a place we'd planned to fill with memories and, eventually, children. Our early years together were simple. We'd take spontaneous road trips down to the coast, watch late-night movies in bed, and share meals at little diners that only we seemed to know about. Those were the times when life felt like it had settled perfectly into place. We'd wake up on Saturday mornings, make coffee, and sit on the porch, talking about everything and nothing at all. Max, our energetic German shepherd, would be sprawled out beside us, his ears twitching every time a car drove past. Family was important to both of us, and our families blended naturally into our lives. My older brother, Daniel, was a defense attorney, a bit of a joker, and married to Gina, a woman who'd become like a sister to me. They had 2 toddlers who brought endless energy and laughter into every gathering. On the other side, Lisa's parents, who also lived in Houston, were the epitome of stability. Her father, a quiet but kind man, had worked in finance for over 30 years, while her mother was warm, nurturing, and always quick with a story about Lisa's childhood. Our social circles expanded as the years passed. While my work kept me busy, Lisa had a close-knit group of friends from her college days, including her best friend, Mindy, a Montessori teacher who had a soft spot for the arts. They'd meet up every few weeks for coffee or a night out, and Lisa would come back with stories about their antics. Mindy had introduced Lisa to a few new faces over time, friends from her work, colleagues from the hospital, and even a few neighbors who had become part of their little group. The names would blur in my mind, but Lisa enjoyed those connections. I was happy to see her so engaged, even if I couldn't keep up with everyone she mentioned. The shift in our relationship started slowly. Lisa became more involved in social events, often mentioning get-togethers with her colleagues or Mindy's friends. I noticed the changes, but I chalked it up to her filling the gaps left by my absence. At first, I was grateful she had a support system, but then, her absences became more frequent, her reasons for staying out a bit too vague. I tried to ignore it, pushing aside the unease gnawing at the back of my mind. Our family gatherings became the rare times I could see Lisa relax. At my parents' house, surrounded by my brother, sister-in-law, and their kids, I felt a sense of completeness. My mom adored Lisa, often saying she was the daughter she'd always wished for, and my dad, a retired school principal, would sit back with a proud smile every time he saw us together. I could tell they saw in Lisa what I did, a person with a good heart, someone who would always be there when it mattered. One evening, my mom pulled me aside after dinner and asked, "Is everything all right, Zach? You seem preoccupied lately." I smiled, brushing it off. "Just work, Mom. The usual stress." But the truth was more complicated. While I tried to be there for family events, my work continued to pull me away. Lisa became the steady presence at these gatherings, my family growing closer to her in ways I hadn't anticipated. Daniel, my brother, had even mentioned how she'd stopped by his office downtown for lunch a few times, something I hadn't known about. I told myself it was nothing, that she was simply making an effort to bond with my family. Yet, something inside me felt unsettled. Our friends became a larger part of our lives, too. Gina, my sister-in-law, was especially fond of Lisa, often inviting her to their home while I was away. They'd spend afternoons baking or taking the kids to the park. Gina would tease me about my long trips, saying I needed to balance work with family life. And then there was Mindy, who was a constant in Lisa's life. Mindy had a bubbly personality and was always up for an adventure. She'd pull Lisa into plans for art shows, concerts, and weekend brunches. I admired how Lisa could navigate both worlds, our family and her friends, with such ease. But part of me worried that I was becoming an outsider in my own life. On one particular trip, I was gone for nearly 2 weeks, handling a difficult project out of state. By the time I returned, the house felt strangely quiet. Lisa greeted me with a warm smile, but her embrace felt different, almost as if she were holding something back. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the weariness of travel. But that night, as we lay in bed, a lingering silence hung between us. I remember asking, "How was your week?" She shrugged, looking at me with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Same old, you know. Work's been busy." Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, and she quickly reached over to silence it. Normally, I wouldn't have thought twice about it, but something about her reaction caught my attention. I wanted to ask her who it was, but I held back, not wanting to seem paranoid. Trust was the foundation of our relationship, and I didn't want to crack it over a passing suspicion. But that night, as I drifted off to sleep, a thought nagged at me, a thought I couldn't shake. What if things weren't as they seemed? The following weekend, we had dinner with my parents. Lisa was cheerful, engaging with everyone, laughing and telling stories as if everything were perfectly normal. But I caught a few moments where she seemed distant, her gaze drifting to her phone more often than usual. My mom noticed it too, giving me a concerned glance across the table. I wanted to believe it was just my imagination, that the distance I felt was just the byproduct of my travel schedule. But the look in her eyes told me otherwise. It wasn't long before the subtle signs began piling up. Lisa would come home later than usual, mentioning last-minute dinners with friends or work obligations. Her explanations felt rehearsed, almost too casual. One evening, as I waited for her to return from an outing with Mindy, I caught myself pacing the living room, my thoughts racing. The trust that had once been so solid now felt fragile, slipping through my fingers like sand. During one of our few quiet weekends together, I tried to bridge the gap, suggesting we take a trip, just the two of us, away from everything. She seemed enthusiastic, even excited, and we planned a weekend getaway to Galveston. But when the day came, Lisa canceled, saying work had come up unexpectedly. I knew the hospital could be demanding, but something in her tone made me question if that was really the case. My brother, Daniel, became my sounding board during this time. He knew Lisa well, and I trusted his opinion. I remember one night over drinks, I confided in him, expressing my doubts. "You think she's hiding something?" he asked, his brow furrowed. I shrugged, feeling a bit foolish for even bringing it up. "I don't know, Dan. Maybe it's just in my head. We've been together so long. It's probably nothing." Daniel took a sip of his drink, studying me. "Listen, Zach, you know Lisa better than anyone. If something doesn't feel right, trust your gut." His words stayed with me, resonating in a way I couldn't ignore. Over the next few weeks, I found myself watching Lisa more closely, noting the little things that I'd once brushed off. The way she'd check her phone discreetly, the quick explanations about her whereabouts, the slight shift in her demeanor whenever I asked her about her day. Then came the night of the charity gala, an event hosted by Sam's Foundation in Houston. Lisa had been looking forward to it for weeks, and as she stood across the ballroom, laughing and mingling, I couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. She was a vision in silver, her dress catching the light with every movement, but as I watched her from a distance, I noticed something that made my heart skip a beat. She was speaking to a man I didn't recognize, her smile lingering a bit too long, her laugh a bit too warm. I tried to shake off the feeling, convincing myself it was just a friendly exchange. But then, as she caught sight of me, her expression shifted, and she quickly looked away. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but in that moment, something inside me broke. The ride home was silent. Lisa was lost in thought, staring out the window as the city lights blurred past. I wanted to ask her about the man at the gala, to confront her about the unease I felt gnawing at me. But the words stuck in my throat, tangled up in fear and denial. As the days passed, our conversations became shorter, our laughter less frequent. I could feel the distance between us growing, an invisible wall that neither of us seemed willing to breach. And yet, a part of me clung to the hope that things could go back to the way they were, that this was just a rough patch we'd find our way through. But deep down, I knew that something had shifted, something that couldn't be ignored. As days turned into weeks, my unease about Lisa's behavior grew, fed by 1,000 small moments. I found myself second-guessing every late night she spent out with friends, every text message she quickly dismissed, and every urgent meeting that kept her at work long past the usual hours. There was no outright lie to catch her in, no undeniable evidence to confirm my fears, just a series of inexplicable shifts that painted an unsettling picture. And yet, even as I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting, that my paranoia was a product of too many late nights and too many missed conversations, a gnawing feeling told me otherwise. One evening, after a particularly long work trip, I returned home to an empty house. The silence felt different this time. I glanced at the clock. 10:45 p.m. Lisa had mentioned she'd be out with Mindy, but I hadn't realized it would run so late. Normally, she'd text or call if she was going to be out past our usual bedtime, but there had been nothing from her that evening. I tried to settle myself, making coffee to stave off the fatigue from my travels, but my mind wouldn't let me rest. I found myself pacing the kitchen, checking my phone every few minutes for any word from her. Around midnight, I heard the front door open. Lisa stepped in, her cheeks flushed, her eyes bright, and a hint of laughter still lingering on her lips. She looked surprised to see me, though I told her I'd be coming home that night. "Oh, hey, Zach. I didn't think you'd be back so soon," she said, her voice light, but something about the way she avoided my gaze told me there was more to the story. "Yeah, I wrapped things up early," I replied, trying to keep my tone casual. "Had to be home." "So, how was your night?" "It was great. Just a casual dinner with Mindy. We went to that new Italian place, Bellinate." She didn't meet my eyes as she spoke, focusing instead on slipping off her shoes. The more I looked at her, the more I noticed the faint scent of unfamiliar cologne clinging to her, the slight smudge of lipstick on her collar. I felt my heart sink, but I swallowed the questions rising in my throat. "That's nice," I managed, forcing a smile. "I'm glad you had a good time." We made small talk as she got ready for bed, but the comfortable silence that once filled our home had turned into something strained, almost suffocating. That night, as I lay next to her, I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing with questions. The scent of cologne lingered in my memory, the slight smudge of lipstick replayed in my mind like a warning bell. Something wasn't right, but I wasn't ready to confront it, not yet. In the days that followed, I found myself caught between wanting to confront her and fearing what I might uncover. I'd always trusted Lisa implicitly, never imagining that there could be secrets lurking beneath the surface. But now, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was a part of her life I didn't know, a part that existed beyond the walls of our home, beyond the vows we'd exchanged. One night, after Lisa had gone to bed, I stayed up, wrestling with my suspicions. I found myself standing outside her home office, a room she rarely let me enter. For years, I'd respected her privacy, but tonight, that respect warred with a desperation for answers. I took a deep breath, telling myself I was overreacting, that I'd find nothing more than work papers and maybe a few notes from Mindy or her colleagues. I turned the handle, the door creaking open. Her desk was neatly arranged, as always. I flipped through a few files, glancing at paperwork from the hospital, invoices, bills, nothing unusual. But then, tucked beneath a stack of receipts, I found a small black notebook. The cover was nondescript, unassuming, but when I opened it, my heart skipped a beat. Inside were dates, times, places, all written in Lisa's familiar handwriting. Some entries were mundane, noting meetings and coffee dates. But as I flipped through, I noticed several entries marked with a small, barely noticeable X. The entries were sparse, but enough to draw a chilling realization. Each X was beside a time and place that coincided with nights she'd told me she was out with Mindy, or working late, or at a friend's gathering. And then there was the name. Scrawled in the margins beside some of these entries was a name I didn't recognize, Michael. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Who was Michael? I stood there, the notebook trembling in my hands, a mixture of anger and heartbreak threatening to consume me. Part of me wanted to confront her right then, to wake her up and demand answers. But another part of me feared what those answers might reveal. I wasn't ready to face the truth, not without knowing for sure. Over the next few days, I did something I never thought I would. I followed her. I watched her leave the house, watched the way she'd glance around as if to make sure she wasn't being observed. One evening, when she told me she'd be meeting Mindy for a late dinner, I waited until she left, then got in my car and followed her. The route was familiar at first, leading towards the city center, but then she took an unexpected turn, heading into a part of town I knew well enough to realize she wasn't meeting Mindy. I kept my distance, my heart pounding as I watched her pull into the parking lot of a small bar. She parked, checked her phone, and after a moment, she got out, her expression unreadable. I held my breath as I watched her walk towards the entrance, her steps quick, purposeful. And then I saw him, a man, tall, dark-haired, with a slight beard, stepped out of the bar, his gaze fixed on Lisa. She smiled, a smile I hadn't seen in months, a smile filled with warmth, familiarity, and something that made my stomach twist. She walked up to him, and without a moment's hesitation, he pulled her into an embrace, holding her close as if they were the only two people in the world. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me, my worst fears solidifying into a painful reality. I'd been a fool, blinded by my trust, by the belief that we were immune to the betrayals that tore other couples apart. I watched them for a moment longer, the pain almost too much to bear. And then, without thinking, I started my car and drove away, unable to watch any longer. The drive home was a blur, my mind numb, my heart shattered. I couldn't believe it, couldn't believe that the woman I'd trusted with my heart, my life, could betray me so completely. Every memory we'd built together, every promise we'd made, felt like a cruel joke. By the time I reached our house, my hands were shaking, and I felt a hollowness settle into my chest, a void that I wasn't sure could ever be filled. That night, I couldn't bring myself to confront her. I couldn't bear the thought of hearing her confirm what I already knew, of watching her try to justify the betrayal that had torn our life apart. Instead, I lay awake, listening to the sound of her breathing beside me, wondering how I'd ever let myself be deceived so easily. Over the next few weeks, I tried to act as if nothing had changed. I went through the motions, pretending that everything was fine, that the woman I loved hadn't torn my heart to pieces. But inside, I was breaking, the weight of the betrayal eating away at me, leaving me a shell of the man I once was. One afternoon, while Lisa was out, I found myself sitting in our living room, surrounded by the life we'd built together. Photos of our vacations lined the walls, memories of happier times that now felt tainted, hollow. I picked up one of the frames, a picture of us on our honeymoon, smiling, carefree, blissfully unaware of the future that lay ahead. I felt a surge of anger rise within me, a rage that I could no longer contain. That night, when she came home, I was waiting for her. She walked in, her smile fading as she saw the look on my face, the expression that I could no longer hide. "Zach, is everything all right?" she asked, her voice laced with concern, but I could see the flicker of guilt in her eyes. I took a deep breath, my hands clenched at my sides. "Who is he, Lisa?" She froze, her face draining of color as the weight of my question sank in. For a moment, I thought she might deny it, might try to brush it off as paranoia or jealousy. But then, her shoulders slumped, and she looked away, unable to meet my gaze. "Zach, The silence that followed was suffocating, filled with all the words left unspoken, all the truths she'd kept hidden. I waited, the anger and pain simmering beneath the surface, refusing to let her off the hook. "Just tell me the truth," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. "I deserve that much." She took a shaky breath, her hands trembling as she wiped away a tear that had slipped down her cheek. "His name is Michael. We met through work." It wasn't supposed to mean anything. It just happened. Her words felt like knives, each one slicing deeper into the wounds that had already begun to fester. I wanted to scream, to demand how she could do this to me, to us. But instead, I stood there, numb, the reality of her betrayal settling over me like a heavy, suffocating weight. How long? I asked, my voice hollow. A few months, she whispered, barely audible. I'm so sorry, Zach. I never meant to hurt you. I let out a bitter laugh, the sound foreign even to my own ears. Well, congratulations, Lisa. You succeeded. She reached out, her hand trembling as she tried to touch me, to offer some semblance of comfort, but I pulled away, unable to bear her touch. The woman I'd loved, the woman I'd trusted, had become a stranger, someone I could no longer recognize. In the days that followed, I withdrew from her completely, shutting down any attempt she made to explain, to apologize. The trust we'd built, the life we'd shared, had been shattered beyond repair, and no words, no gestures, could ever undo the damage that had been done. Our home became a silent battlefield, each room a reminder of what we'd lost, of the love that had turned to ashes. Lisa continued to live there, but we were no longer a couple, no longer the people we'd once been. We were two strangers, bound by the memories of a life that no longer existed. And as I walked through the halls of our home, the betrayal echoing in every corner, I knew that I could never forgive her, that the woman I'd loved had been replaced by a stranger who'd taken everything I held dear and destroyed it. The days after Lisa's confession passed in a blur of anger, resentment, and something even darker, a desire to make her feel the weight of the pain she'd inflicted. It was a side of me I hadn't known existed, a part of myself I'd always believed I was above. But betrayal has a way of uncovering the deepest corners of a person's soul, and in those corners, I found a rage I couldn't control. Lisa had tried to apologize, to justify her actions as a mistake, but every word out of her mouth only fueled my anger. The memories of us, the laughter, the late nights, the dreams we'd shared, all felt hollow now, tainted by the lies she'd fed me. And the worst part? She continued to live in our house, move through our rooms, and sleep in our bed, as if nothing had changed. It was an insult, a constant reminder of her betrayal, and I could feel it eating away at me. I couldn't just let this go. I couldn't be one of those men who simply forgives and moves on. No, I needed her to feel what I was feeling, to understand the depth of the pain and humiliation I'd endured. And so, my mind began to turn over ways to make her suffer, to make her feel the weight of every tear she'd caused, every sleepless night she'd brought upon me. My first instinct was to confront Michael, the man who had inserted himself into our lives without a second thought. I wanted to see his face, to let him know exactly what he'd done. But as I thought about it, I realized that Michael wasn't the one who owed me anything. He hadn't broken any promises, hadn't built a life with me. That was all Lisa. No, the revenge I wanted was more personal. It needed to be something that would leave her as hollow and broken as I felt. I wanted her to watch as everything she held dear slipped through her fingers, just as she'd watched our life crumble with indifference. So, I waited. I bided my time, observing her every move, listening to her excuses, and planning how to dismantle the world she thought she'd gotten away with destroying. In the days that followed, Lisa tried to rebuild some semblance of normalcy, going about her routines as if she could somehow erase the damage with a few well-placed apologies. She'd come home with dinners, trying to cook for us, trying to make small talk, as if our relationship hadn't shattered beyond repair. Her attempts at reconciliation only deepened my resentment. How could she think a few kind gestures could undo the betrayal? It was almost insulting in its simplicity. One evening, after she tried yet again to bridge the chasm between us, I looked at her, my voice calm but cold. "Lisa," I said, my gaze steady, "do you really think a few dinners, a few nights spent pretending like nothing's happened, can fix this? Do you think I'll ever look at you the same way again?" She flinched, her eyes brimming with tears. "Zach, please, I know I made a mistake. I know I hurt you, but I want to make it right." I laughed, the sound bitter. "Right? There's no making it right, Lisa. There's no undoing what you've done." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. I could see the guilt in her eyes, the way she struggled to hold my gaze. But I didn't feel an ounce of sympathy. She had made her choice, and now it was time for her to live with the consequences. Over the next few weeks, I set my plan in motion. I started by isolating her, cutting her off from the support systems she'd relied on so heavily. I stopped attending family gatherings with her, subtly letting our friends and family know that things were strained between us. At first, she tried to keep up appearances, but it became clear that people were starting to notice the cracks in our relationship. She'd go out, only to come back with stories of the questions, the concerned glances, the pitying looks from friends who could sense the tension. Mindy, who'd always been her closest confidant, was the first to confront her. One afternoon, I overheard Lisa on the phone, her voice low and strained as she tried to reassure her friend that everything was fine, that we were just going through a rough patch. But even I could tell that Mindy wasn't buying it. The longer Lisa tried to explain, the more desperate her voice became, until finally, she hung up, her face pale and her hands trembling. Her once perfect world was beginning to crack, and I could see the fear in her eyes as she realized how alone she was becoming. I felt a grim satisfaction watching her struggle, knowing that she was beginning to understand the depth of the isolation she'd created with her choices. But I wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. The next step in my plan was more subtle, a psychological game meant to keep her on edge, to make her question every aspect of her life. I started by moving things around in the house, small objects, items she used daily. I'd rearrange her closet, shift her makeup, move her keys to a different spot. At first, she brushed it off as forgetfulness, a minor annoyance. But as the days went by, I saw her growing increasingly unsettled, glancing over her shoulder, her eyes darting around the room as if she expected something, or someone, to be lurking in the shadows. One night, as she searched frantically for her phone, I watched her, my face expressionless. She turned to me, her voice laced with frustration. "Have you seen my phone, Zach?" "I know I left it on the counter." I shrugged, feigning innocence. "I haven't touched it." She looked at me, suspicion flickering in her eyes. But she didn't say anything, just turned and continued her search. I could see the tension building, the way her hands shook as she picked up items, checking and rechecking the same spots. She was beginning to unravel, and it was exactly what I wanted. As the weeks passed, I took things further, planting small reminders of her betrayal around the house. Subtle, almost invisible gestures that would only make sense to her. I'd leave a single wine glass on the counter, a faint trace of lipstick on its rim, as if someone else had been in the house. I'd place a cologne bottle in the bathroom, one she'd never seen me wear. Every small gesture was calculated, designed to remind her of her infidelity, to make her question if I was doing the same thing she had. One evening, as we sat in silence over dinner, she finally broke. "Zach," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper, "are you seeing someone else?" I looked at her, my expression unreadable. Would it matter if I was? Her face crumpled, her hands shaking as she clutched her fork. I could see the anguish in her eyes, the way she struggled to hold back tears. But I felt nothing. No sympathy, no guilt, only the satisfaction of knowing she was feeling a fraction of the pain she'd inflicted on me. The final step in my plan was the most devastating, a blow that would shatter any hope she had of redemption. I reached out to Michael, her so-called mistake, arranging to meet him in a public place where we wouldn't draw attention. He looked uncomfortable when he saw me, his face pale as he realized who I was. "I'm not here to fight you," I said calmly, taking a seat across from him. "I just thought you should know what's been going on." Michael shifted uncomfortably, his gaze flickering around the room. "Listen, Zach, I never meant for any of this to happen." I held up a hand, cutting him off. "Save it. I don't care about your excuses. I just want you to know what you've done." For the next hour, I laid everything out, detailing the destruction he and Lisa had caused, the pain they'd inflicted without a second thought. I could see the guilt in his eyes, the way he struggled to meet my gaze as I described the fallout of their actions. By the time I was finished, he was visibly shaken, his face pale and his hands trembling. "You think this is over?" I said, my voice cold. "You think you can just walk away and pretend like none of this happened?" He looked down, his voice barely audible. I'm sorry, Zach. I really am. I laughed, the sound harsh. Sorry doesn't fix anything. You've taken something from me that can never be replaced. And now, you're going to live with that, just like she will. I left him there, sitting in silence, a broken man who'd finally begun to understand the weight of his actions. As I walked away, I felt a sense of closure, a grim satisfaction that my revenge was complete. But as I drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still missing, that the hollow ache in my chest had only deepened. When I returned, Lisa was waiting for me, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. She must have sensed that something had shifted, that the game we'd been playing had finally reached its end. She looked at me, her voice trembling as she spoke. Zach, where were you? I stared at her, my expression unreadable. I went to see Michael. Her face went white, her hands clenching at her sides as she struggled to hold back tears. Why? Why would you do that? Because he deserves to know the kind of person he's dealing with, I replied coldly. And because I wanted him to feel the same pain you've caused me. She broke down then, sobbing, her body shaking as she crumbled under the weight of her guilt. But as I watched her, I felt no satisfaction, no relief, only an emptiness that seemed to stretch endlessly, a void that revenge had failed to fill. In the end, I realized that my revenge had brought me nothing but more pain, more heartache. The woman I'd loved was gone, replaced by a stranger who wore her face but held none of the warmth or trust that had once defined our life together. And as I stood there, watching her fall apart, I knew that the damage we'd done to each other could never be undone, that we were both prisoners of a betrayal that had destroyed everything we'd once held dear. And with that realization, I turned away, leaving her to face the consequences of her choices, just as I would have to face mine. In the weeks that followed, the silence between Lisa and me grew deeper, almost suffocating. Our home had become a battlefield where neither of us dared to speak, where every glance was filled with memories of broken promises and unspoken regrets. She was still there, moving through the house like a ghost, barely a trace of the woman I once knew. One evening, as I sat alone on the porch, I felt the weight of everything pressing down on me, the anger, the revenge, the emptiness that followed. I had wanted to hurt her, to make her feel every ounce of the pain she'd caused, and I'd succeeded. But in doing so, I'd only deepened my own wounds. I didn't know if either of us could ever escape the prison we'd built, a place haunted by choices neither of us could undo. Lisa joined me on the porch that night, her face drawn, her eyes shadowed by weeks of restless nights. She sat beside me in silence, both of us staring out into the darkness, unable to bridge the distance between us. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely more than a whisper. Zach, do you think we'll ever be okay? I didn't answer right away. I wanted to say yes, to offer her some semblance of hope, but the words wouldn't come. I wasn't sure if we could ever mend what had been shattered, or if we even wanted to. The scars of betrayal ran too deep, and the person I'd become, the person revenge had shaped me into, was a stranger even to myself. I don't know, I said, my voice thick with the weight of uncertainty. I don't know if we can ever go back to who we were. And maybe we're not supposed to. She looked away, her expression unreadable. In that moment, I realized that perhaps this was the closest we would come to closure. Not a clean break or a rekindling of what was lost, but a quiet, shared understanding that some things, once broken, cannot be fully repaired. As we sat in the fading twilight, both of us bound by the choices we'd made and the wounds we'd inflicted, I wondered if this was our new reality, a life lived in the shadow of what might have been, a love forever marked by the scars of betrayal. Only time would tell if we could ever find our way back, or if we were destined to drift apart, haunted by the memory of a life we could never reclaim. In the end, as we sat together in the silence, I realized that I might never have the answers, that the future was as uncertain as the love that had once held us together.